It's great to be with you today. Today's a special day. We're going to talk about Louisiana Key Academy. And we've talked about it in references in the past. You've met some of the employees for Louisiana Key Academy. But today I really want to go into depth about the foundations for the schools, why the schools exist, and what is the science that the schools are based on. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I hope this is helpful for you. You're going to see a series of slides as a slide presentation. Feel free to share this with others. It's really, I believe, very important information. And as always, we at the Dyslexia Resource Center that partners with and is part of Louisiana Key Academy, thank you for caring about dyslexic students. So we know that dyslexia is very common. 1 in 5 students have dyslexia. And what that means is that in every classroom, there is a child, at least one, struggling with dyslexia. Now, we know that these kids are white, Black, Hispanic, Asian. We know they're girls, we know they're boys, and we know that they're in every classroom. The school is for students that are struggling with dyslexia. So, like any complex entity, there can be moderate, severe dyslexia, or just mild. The school is for those with moderate to severe dyslexia. Again, those that have failed a grade, failed a class, but they are struggling in school. And this is a tuition-free option for those students. So, and you're going to see why that's so important. This is a tale of two students, of those that get what they need and the life they have versus those that don't. So we know in Louisiana, and this is not just Louisiana, this is across the country, less than 1% of dyslexics have been identified. And we know that by data collections. And so again, we know that dyslexia is common, but it's not commonly identified. And so again, we're going to hear from a woman, Professor Kathy Renan, who's dyslexic, and she's a smart kid, and she was struggling to read. So we're going to start off hearing her story.
As an only child, Kathy Renan gravitated toward grown-ups, especially smart ones.
I was kind of an intellectual, geeky kid. I'd go to a dinner party and there was a kids' table and an adults' table, and I was like, I'd rather sit at the adults' table because the conversation will be more interesting.
You were a nerdy little kid.
I was a nerdy little kid.
Come first grade, the nerdy kid landed in the highest reading group at school, only to realize she could not learn to read.
And they're like, okay, let's drop her down a little bit. Nope, how about down a little farther? And I don't know how many reading groups there are, but I was in the bottom.
Determined that her smart child not fail, Drenan's mother did research, found a specialist, and got the diagnosis: severe dyslexia.
For someone who is not dyslexic, is it like if I were to look at Arabic?
That's sort of how I felt, like I just couldn't make any sense.
She ended up teaching herself to read in the 6th grade, but not the way most of us do.
I recognize the shape of words, and I see the shape, and I say, oh, that's that word, and then I memorize what that word sounds like. So where did this equation come from?
She seems to have gotten good at it. Drenan is now a tenured professor of chemistry and biology at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
The way that I learned to view the world from learning to read, memorizing these shapes and looking at shapes and thinking of what is that shape, what is this language, what is this code, definitely makes me a better scientist. And I would come along and look at this and go, I recognize that shape.
Though encouraging, isolated success stories like Drenan's also remind Dr. Cassidy of the challenges ahead.
How are we as society doing in terms of dealing with this problem?
Terrible. We should be screening for dyslexia at the end of kindergarten. So 2 things you saw at the end of that video, a student wrote, you know, my goal is to be a superhero. And that's what we want, right? So again, Kathy Drenan's story is unusual. She's extremely smart, and she memorized in order to read. And everybody has memorization to an extent in learning to read. It's part of the process. But there's another part that we're going to talk about, which she didn't get. So she ends up memorizing in the 6th grade. So she's, again, very unusual. So we're going to, again, go through this presentation, hopefully help you understand why this is so important to make sure that the kids are identified and getting those reading acquisition skills from the foundation up. The other thing that we're going to talk a lot about is screening at the end of kindergarten. So if we look here, you can see that a dyslexic reader, as opposed to a non-dyslexic reader, the IQ does not influence reading. As opposed to the non-dyslexic reader, the IQ influences reading. They correlate. So when we look at this slide, the next slide, an unexpected difficulty, that's what dyslexia is. You see, again, going back to the previous slide, that they're smart, but their reading isn't commensurate with their IQ. And that is one of the reasons it is so unexpected. And so a lot of times the teachers will say, oh, they're bright, just wait, give it more time. But no, it's something that has urgency to it. And again, we'll talk about why. But again, we're trying to erase that stigma. These are bright children with an isolated phonological awareness deficit. So here's that definition, and this is not the whole definition, but this is part of it. This is in Louisiana law, and it is in federal law. An unexpected difficulty in reading for an individual who has the intelligence to be a much better reader. And that difficulty is based on phonology, the phonological processing deficit. So if we look at the sounds of spoken language, that gives us a clue into the origins of the difficulty in dyslexia. So we're going to talk a lot about matching the spoken language to print, to the alphabet, to words, because that is what's going on in order for us to read. And phonology, phono means sound. So you can see that the difficulties that arise when you have a difficult time or unable to match the spoken language with the written word. As we've talked about, you can have difficulty in reading, certainly difficulty in spelling. We see that across the board with dyslexia. We also see problems with the foreign language, which occurs later in their education. And then the one on the far left, those word retrieval issues. And that's important, especially when the child is anxious. They'll have a hard time either answering a question, bringing up what that word is they want to say, but also reading out loud. It can be terrifying for dyslexic students, especially if they aren't reading on grade level, especially if they feel under pressure. So if we talk a little bit more about underlying what is this? Why does print have meaning? This is the essence of what dyslexia is about. And so if we look in the evolution, the timeline of humanity, we know that man started to speak thousands, millions of years ago. And this is a spontaneous occurrence for the most part. Now, some people will have delayed speech. Some people will have articulation issues that they have to go to the speech therapist. But by and large, we learn to speak on our own. It's natural. Our brain has adapted to it. It is something that we all do to communicate with each other for the most part. Now, reading, on the other hand, is a fairly new phenomenon in the last several thousand years at the most. And so then what we've done is we've said, okay, we're going to match the spoken word to these lines and circles to give them meaning. And again, we're back to that word phonology. And this is the problem that dyslexics have it is the fundamental process by which you learn to read is again starting with the alphabet, matching that written word, which is at its basic part is the alphabet, with sound. So if we look at school age clues, we'll see the word retrieval difficulties, which we mentioned. Let's talk a little bit again about trouble learning letters, the alphabet, because that's early, right? So we want them to learn the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, etc. But we also want the children to know the sounds of the alphabet. The letter A could be A or it could be ah. B is B. C, K, S, and so forth. And what you'll see with dyslexic students when they're young is they may know the alphabet one day, or they may know it in the morning, they don't know it in the afternoon, they may know it one day and they don't know the next day. They're not messing with you, they're not lazy. This is just something that, because they're using what we call an inefficient system, they're reading on the right side of the brain, in the front of the brain rather than the back of the left side, it doesn't work as well. And so these skills have to be repeated. This is the foundation that must be learned to acquire real reading skills. And it is more work because it's in an inefficient system in the dyslexic brain. We talked about avoiding reading out loud. And we'll talk a little bit about that more later, but that's an incredible way to really understand what difficulties a student is having with reading. When you hear them read out loud, but it's got to be done in a safe place. They're slow readers because that inefficient system isn't as fast as this left posterior system. And so that's going to be part of reading fluency, the speed. They might say reading is boring. It's better than saying I can't read. We talked about spelling difficulties, handwriting when it's difficult. We would recommend the typewriter, excuse me, it shows you how old I am, the computer, which has the typing programs, the foreign language, attention fragile. This is that, again, it's that work of reading for dyslexia we talk about. And really important is the self-esteem. That's what we want to get these kids identified early. They're smart. They're going to be struggling in first grade. They're going to be comparing themselves to their peers. And they're going to be wondering, why can't I do this? Why am I having a problem? And it's so important that it has a name. And then we address that name dyslexia. We address those issues with the phonology, the phonemic awareness, the phonological processing. And then we really build up their strengths. So I want to show you, again, if we talked about a tale of two students, or these happen to be adults, but they were obviously both students, and let you hear about Jonathan, who had a very different route than Professor Renan.
We're told reading is fundamental. So what happens to the millions of children struggling with words? For our cover story, Susan Spencer looks into the mysteries of dyslexia.
There's diminished high school graduation, diminished entry into college and college graduation, and we know that there's the number of people with dyslexia that are incarcerated.
A fact that led Dr. Cassidy to this Louisiana maximum security prison. And that led, just recently, to an astonishing finding.
Of the prisoners that we screened and tested, we found that over 50% had dyslexia.
Over 50%.
Over 50%.
So more than half.
More than half.
21-year-old Jonathan Wilson is one of the inmates in Dr. Cassidy's study. He has dyslexia, but until now, no one knew it.
What was it like when you were first learning to read, when you were a little kid?
It was real slow. It was real hard for me to understand the words.
Wilson, a first-time offender, is serving a 12-year sentence.
Did you finish high school?
No.
And what happened?
I got charged with armed robbery.
You got charged with armed robbery, and you got convicted of armed robbery.
Yes.
So here we are.
Yeah, so here we are.
What do you say to people who might say, why should I care about dyslexia in prisons?
It's a life. Why wouldn't you want to help the life? And then if we want to reduce recidivism, you can do that if you identify them as dyslexic and give them the tools that they need. So again, thinking about Louisiana Key Academy, we need more schools so that incidents like this don't happen. So what we saw in this paper, which was published in the Journal of Corrections, is that a large number of these adults with dyslexia were never identified as dyslexic, and they dropped out of school in middle school and in high school. Now, Jonathan didn't drop out. He had finished the 10th grade. He had come down to Louisiana to visit his grandmother. And he obviously got with the wrong group of kids. But I asked him, one, had he ever been told he was dyslexic? And no, he hadn't. Two, I tested Jonathan, and he's extremely bright, and he cannot read. And he said, I knew if I could learn to read, I could have the world. But he never learned to read. So he is a poignant but very tragic case of what happens when we are not identifying these students so that they're not dropping out and instead they're getting what they need in school. So again, the failure to screen for and identify dyslexia is very high. We know they have no self-awareness why they can't do what peers are doing. They're bullied. They see self as not meant for school with a high dropout rate. They're more likely to be incarcerated, and they're half as likely to go to college, earning significantly less lifetime earnings. This again just points these out. So it's to me, a crisis, and we're going to talk about how to address that. If we look at NAEP, which is the nation's report card, this is something that's done every 2 years. These are fourth grade reading scores, which are important because, again, that reading acquisition skills, huge in first and second. Learning to read is really a first through fifth grade phenomenon. Where you read percent-wise, that's going to stick with you for the rest of your life by the end of fifth grade. So we look at 2024 in Louisiana, you see we have 40% students reading below grade level, as opposed to nationwide, it's 41%. So it's really not that different. The good news is Louisiana's come down from 56% to 40%. That's great news. But let's look at that 40% that are going to be functionally illiterate. Now we look at the 29% in Louisiana and nationwide that are reading at basic. So this correlates to a number. There's a number range in the basic. So you're going to have a large group or a percent of the group that is at the bottom of the basic level, close to below basic. So my premise is if we take the 40% of those reading below basic, the bottom of those reading at basic, which is at least 10%, we've got half, 50% of the population in the schools in the fourth grade, which predicts reading levels, prison entry, etc., reading below basic, and in the United States. Now, there are studies, I'm not going to go into today, but there are studies that look at this test, and we can, I think, reasonably know that there is a good percentage of these kids that are dyslexic. They're not all dyslexic, but of those 50% that are functionally illiterate, a large portion of those students are dyslexic, again, in Louisiana and elsewhere. And if we look at, again, this article came out within the last year, again, we know that at least half of the third graders are not reading at grade level. For me, I don't think the answer is having them repeat third grade. I am focused on encouraging, and I hope you will, that we identify these kids at the end of kindergarten, first or the beginning of first grade. You can look at the legislation that's been passed over the years by Senator Conrad Appel and Representative Joe Marino. And I want to talk a little bit about Act 266, which is again screening at the end of kindergarten. So if we look at what the state of Louisiana picked, they picked the Shaywitz Dyslexia Screener. It can be first given at the end of kindergarten. That is the first time that we can reliably have any statistical information that is valid that a student is dyslexic when they're 6, end of kindergarten. So that's when the Shaywitz Dyslexia Screener is done. Now, a screener does only one thing. It says you're at risk, and in this case, it would be dyslexia, or you're not at risk at dyslexia. And Dr. Bennett Shaywitz and I have spoken, and Dr. Sally Shaywitz on another podcast about screeners and testing. But the dyslexia screener, Pearson owns it. They developed it with a lot of time and money. Its validity is very high. There is not a higher screener validity for dyslexia available. Now, one of the complaints I hear is, oh, the teachers give it. It's not the students giving the screener. That's true. So think of this as if you're going to the pediatrician with your child or your grandchild, where the pediatrician is assessing, has your child met milestones? And this is what the screener is for the dyslexia Shaywitz screener. Has the child met age-appropriate language milestones? That's what we're looking for. We're not looking for just one little skills test, because that is going to actually not be as accurate in identifying those at risk for dyslexia. So this is a short screener that the teacher does at the end of the year, taking their assessment from being with the child all year. It's a quick assessment. It's done on the computer, and then Pearson puts it through its statistical model and gives the teacher, yes, this child is risk for dyslexia. No, it's not. Now, if the child is at risk for dyslexia, they should get a letter. The parent should get a letter saying that their child is at risk for dyslexia. It's a huge red flag. And in these end of year kindergarten screener, what we call the arc under the curve, which looks at the statistical validity for probability, and it is 0.83, which is very high. The screener gets even higher, up to 0.9, like second grade. But again, we're trying to identify them early because we know that they've already got an academic gap in the first grade. So we're encouraging parents, we're encouraging schools, if the child is at risk on the screener, it's a huge red flag, it's very valid. Have the child tested, really tested. And what I tell people is, look, the majority of those students are going to have dyslexia. Some of them are not. But whether you have dyslexia or not, it is a red flag. They are struggling in kindergarten skills for reading acquisition. So whether it's dyslexia or something else, the way that the parent is going to get what the student needs, the way that the school is going to be best serving the student, which is what we're there for, is to do that testing and find out, are they dyslexic? And if they're not dyslexic, why is it they're struggling? So the other thing that Louisiana does, and I suspect most states do, is a literacy screener. And these are more skill tests, like we discussed. They're given 3 times a year, and they're given in K through 3rd grade. And this is a quick tool and also can give you red flags for identifying dyslexia. This and the screener both combine, or if the child is in a first, second, or third grade, if they have failed one of these tests, then I would say they need to be screened, and if at risk for dyslexia, tested. So let's talk about these. These are, again, going back to those reading acquisition skills. So you see in kindergarten and first grade, letter naming fluency. So that is the alphabet. Does the child know the alphabet? Not only the alphabet, but the sounds of the alphabet. And I can tell you at Louisiana Key Academy, there are students entering first, second, and third grade that do not know the sounds of the alphabet. Those children cannot learn to read without knowing this basic, fundamental piece of reading acquisition skills. The second is phonemic segmentation. That's kindergarten and first grade. So when a child is learning to read, they have to understand that a word is an envelope of sounds. Simple example would be cat is k-a-t. The brain must take the word, pull it apart, attach the sound to the letters, and then put the word back together to either speak it or read it. The brain is just amazing, right? And we do this routinely without thinking of it, but the brain is wired to do this if instructed at a young age for reading. So that phonemic segmentation, that's what it's looking at. It is, again, that gateway, that foundation skill, that phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, which then allows this decoding, pulling the word apart, attaching the sounds, and put it back together. Huge. Nonsense word fluency in K through 3 is just, again, that same skill. Because as I said with Dr. Drennan, Professor Drennan, she memorized. And again, that's part of reading. We know that we teach kids sight words. But what nonsense word fluency does is it's like taking words that you haven't memorized. Can you pull that word apart? Can you attach that sounds to those letters? Can you put the word back together and understand what the word is, pronounce the word, read the word? So nonsense word fluency is a big skill that's necessary to understand if the child might be dyslexic, and certainly if they're on the pathway to skilled reading. Then we have word reading fluency, and those would be not nonsense words, but your typical words like, in the beginning, we're looking at cat, bat, hat, and then it's going to go up to more complicated words like a shot or ride or test, etc. Then if we look at oral reading fluency in the first, second, and third grade, I believe this is a really important test. I think it gives you, oral reading gives you so much information. And I don't think that we're using it enough. So when reading fluency, the goal is not single word fluency. It is really text fluency, right? We want to read a book, an article, a paragraph. It's more than a word. This is when you've acquired reading skills, when you've got good reading fluency. And reading fluency is composed of accuracy. That means you can decode, match those sounds to letters, put those sounds back together, and you know what the word is. That's important. And that's got to be taught very early on. Then you want to be teaching it that that word accuracy by just the instruction, but also reading. And because when they're reading, they're learning vocabulary, which is going to help them with that accuracy piece. Again, that's the first part, the accuracy. Can I say what a word is so that I know that tool or a book, I know what that word is. But then there's the speed. So dyslexics as we said, read from this right anterior part of the brain. So they're going to be slower readers because it's an inefficient system. But you want them to get faster, and you want it to be less work. So that's part of your fluency testing. And the way they become better readers and they can read more quickly, whether they're dyslexic or not dyslexic, is by reading passages, is by reading books, is by oral language in school, is by increasing their vocabulary. So that's a huge piece. So we've got, for fluency, we've got accuracy, we've got speed, and then we've got prosody. Prosody is intonation, and it's a huge marker. It's telling you so much, because if your child is reading like this, and it is flat, and it may be accurate, but it's flat, a little labored, they are working hard to read. If the child is Jack and Jill went up the hill and, fetched a pail of water, then you know that they've got that accuracy piece. They are reading for comprehension. That is the goal. They're not just reading for accuracy. So again, reading out loud, and especially these oral reading fluency tests, they're great for tracking progress. The CTOP, which I talk about again in another podcast, looks at those fundamental phonemic awareness and phonological processing issue. The oral reading fluency tests really help you with taking the accuracy, the speed, and the intonation. Because if they're working hard to read, they're not going to be comprehending much. It's more of an exercise in accuracy. And that's really important, because comprehension is a whole different skill set than just learning reading fluency. Reading fluency leads to comprehension. So again, this is given by the state in Louisiana. I suspect most states do it 3 times a year. If the child has failed any of these, that is a red flag. If they've passed them, they still could be dyslexic. But if they've failed them, it's a red flag. And in my mind, they should be evaluated further. So we go back to why this is so important. This end of year kindergarten screening for dyslexia, these K through 3 reading acquisition. We want to pick up these kids as dyslexic at the end of kindergarten or the first of first grade, because the academic gap is there in the first grade. It never goes completely away, but we can prevent it from growing. If it's not identified, that gap just continues to grow, slamming the child's self-esteem and preventing them from having content knowledge, because they're not going to comprehend anything because they can't read anything. So it's the tale of two students. The student that's identified, given an education like Louisiana Key has, which in those early years is 90 minutes a day of structured literacy by a qualified language therapist, and that versus not identified, sitting in first and second grade and beyond, feeling terrible about themselves and not learning those foundational skills, so they cannot access the reading system. They will be functionally illiterate, just as we saw on the NAEP scores. So in closing, I want to play a video by Dr. Sally and Bennett Shaywitz. They're both with the Yale Dyslexia and Creativity Center. They've been fundamental and instrumental in the creation of the Louisiana Key Academy. They're both in the National Academy of Science. They've spent their life really understanding and providing evidence about dyslexia. I think once you start to see it from their perspective and from their work, it makes sense. And I appreciate you listening to this, and I hope you'll share it. And we'll close out with this word from the Shawitzes.
Dyslexia is very prevalent. 1 out of 5. They don't get the attention, they don't get help, and they're smart.
LKA is so remarkable because it's a model for the country. Dyslexia is so common, and LKA is the model that can be used across the country.
There aren't many schools in Louisiana that cater to children with dyslexia.
It started about 10 years ago, and we're very happy to have it in Baton Rouge.
I've always said I wanted to work with those kids who I can't give time to, and this school gives that time to them.
I've seen her confidence bloom in only the last month. I mean, it's just amazing to see the kids wanting to read.
I think it's something that we need. There's a lot of children that are benefiting from this school.
Supporting LKA is important to help kids with dyslexia and learn new ways to help support them through their learning environments.
Most people don't appreciate how common dyslexia is because there are no outward signs, so they're not instantly recognized. 1 out of 5, 20% of the population. You know what that means? That means every class has students who are dyslexic, but they're often not recognized and not helped. Whenever we visit, I come away so happy because I see the joy in the classroom and how happy the kids are and the teachers. And there's no reason this can't be in other schools.
So I want to thank you so much for listening today. And I encourage you to reach out to the Dyslexia Resource Center, which is a part of Louisiana Key Academy. If you have questions, we're here to help you. You'll also see a link to both Louisiana Key Academy and Dyslexia Resource Center. As you know, the DRC trains teachers, we tutor students, and we also have the school. So have a great day. We look forward to seeing you on the next podcast.